He once told me I was the only good thing he had. He just didn't have the guts to admit it. Emily stood quietly behind a row of trees at Greenlawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles. It was an October morning. Cloudless sky, soft sunlight, and the air carried a mix of white chrysanthemum and incense. One by one, people in black suits, black dresses, and ash-gray coats made their way to the velvet-covered casket in the middle of the cemetery. No one saw her. No one knew who she was. She stood about 20 steps away from the funeral, close enough to hear the pastor's final words, but not close enough to end up in anyone's photo. It was all once so familiar. The backyard of Richard's mansion, the oak dining room, the balcony that looked out over the ocean. Now she was just an outsider, a shadow at the edge of her own story. Emily Jameson, 32, from Boise, Idaho, a small town most people in Los Angeles only recognize from the weather forecast. She was a temp secretary, once hired on a 3-month contract at Orion Capital, the major investment firm founded by Richard Bennett. Her resume didn't stand out. A degree in office administration, an advanced Excel certificate, and stints at 5 small companies no one remembered. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, she didn't have any friends in the industry. But she had once been the wife of the most powerful man at that funeral, a truth no one there knew. She didn't get an invitation from his daughter, not a word from Orion Capital's press office, and no one from his family reached out, even though she was the one who called 911. The one who watched him pass quietly. When the funeral came, it was as if she had never existed. Emily began walking slowly toward the cemetery gates, still keeping her distance. Every eye was fixed on the casket. No one turned around. She wore a simple beige coat, her hair pulled back neatly, no tears. She wouldn't let herself cry here. In her mind, the first moment she met Richard replayed, 4 years ago. It was her first day at Orion Capital. The elevator stopped on the 27th floor. She stepped in, accidentally standing close to a tall man in a light gray suit, wearing a Cartier watch but no assistant, rare in that building. He wasn't staring at his phone, not scrolling through a schedule. He was looking at her. "You're new here?" he said, deep voice clear with the polite sarcasm of someone used to wealth. "Yes, I'm the temp secretary for the operations team," Emily replied, clutching her folder. "Where are you from?" he asked, like he genuinely wanted to know. "Boise, Idaho. Does it still snow there in March?" The question made her laugh. She said, "Yeah, and the coffee sucks too." Richard laughed. That was the first time he asked her out for coffee, not in a conference room, not at the kind of upscale place investors usually went, but at Java Grove, a small cafe near the building where students and young staff went for cheap drinks and good donuts. "Do you like Van Gogh or Monet?" he asked on their second meeting. "Edward Hopper," she answered. Richard nodded, eyes lighting up like he'd just uncovered a secret. "There's something about you. Very American, very real. Not like the people I usually meet around here." From that moment on, she stepped into his life like a soft pencil line, nothing flashy, nothing loud, and he stepped into hers like a contradiction. Part romance, part wall she could never quite climb. Emily walked slowly along the gravel path. The ceremony was winding down. A young woman, Richard's daughter, stepped up to speak. She thanked friends, colleagues, and everyone who meant something in my father's life. Emily wasn't part of that everyone, even though she had been his legal wife. Even though for the past 4 years, she was the one who made his coffee every morning, picked out his ties, and fixed every little error in the pitch decks he presented to the investment board. But no one knew, because he never told anyone. She pulled a white envelope from her coat pocket. Inside were 3 things: their marriage certificate, a scanned copy of a handwritten letter Richard had written when he proposed, and a wedding photo taken on a phone, Richard smiling in a way she'd never seen in any press photo of him. Emily didn't plan to say a word. She just needed to leave that envelope exactly where it belonged and walk away. She once asked Richard, "Why do we always have to meet in places no one knows about?" He looked at her, half smiling, half avoiding. Because in those places, there's no one around to make you feel like you're being compared. After their first coffee at Java Grove, every meeting after that was arranged like a secret appointment. No texts, no public calls. They used a private calendar app, the kind busy CEOs favor, to schedule times. Wednesday, 7:15 p.m. at the Lantern, a small bar on a Santa Monica corner, quiet, warmly lit, with old wooden tables and servers who never asked too many questions. The Lantern felt like the perfect place to love without being seen. At first, Emily didn't really mind the secrecy. She was never one for noise. To her, a deep conversation in a quiet corner always meant more than a crowded cocktail party. But the longer they were together, the more she realized this wasn't just discreet. It was hidden. One time, while they were having dinner at the Lantern, Richard got a call. He stepped outside to take it. When he came back to the table, he simply said, "My daughter, she's working at the DA's office, ambitious, just like her mother." It was the first time he ever mentioned his family. He'd been divorced for years. His ex-wife, a well-known journalist, once had a cover story in The New Yorker. They had 2 kids, Clara, 28, a criminal lawyer, and Zachary, 22, a poli-sci student at Harvard. "Clara always assumed I'd remarry someone, at least a CEO," Richard said, avoiding Emily's eyes. "And her mom hoped I'd settle down with someone who has a verified LinkedIn profile." Emily smiled, hiding the sting in her chest. She didn't have a LinkedIn, just a rarely updated Facebook account and a phone with a scratched-up screen. "I never needed the perfect woman by their standards," Richard continued. "I just needed someone who made me feel at peace when I took off my tie and came home." Emily didn't say anything, but that line stayed with her for the next 3 years. They had no photos together, no public posts. Their nights usually ended in a month-to-month rental, not Richard's actual home. A neutral space with no personal items, nothing to suggest she had ever been part of his life. Emily wasn't jealous. She was just sad. Other women she knew, even her friends back in Idaho, had boyfriends who posted their pictures, wrote sweet captions, tagged them in love songs. And her? She was a secret without a hashtag. But Emily wasn't the type to make a scene. She didn't scream for a title, didn't post cryptic statuses. She kept everything to herself, just like her mother once taught her. If you want someone to truly choose you, don't push. Let them come to it on their own. Richard often looked at her the way men only do once in a lifetime, the look of someone who's missed too much and knows it. Whenever he said, "You remind me I'm still human," she believed him. And because of that, she stayed. One night, after leaving a charity gala where Richard had shown up with the Orion Capital Board, he drove her around the quiet suburbs near Pasadena. It was late. No traffic, just soft music from the radio and the dim streetlights sliding across the windshield. "I was going to propose to you tonight," he said. "But then I thought maybe it's not the right time." "What makes it not right?" Emily asked. "Clara's about to get a promotion, and if she finds out—" He didn't finish the sentence. She leaned her head against the window. For the first time, she felt like a stray cat someone pets at night, only to disappear before the homeowner wakes up. A month later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, Richard told her he wanted to go somewhere with no schedule, no pressure. They drove nearly 3 hours to the outskirts of Montecito, to a place where he once had an old vacation home. He stopped in front of a small church called St. Elm's, red brick, sharp roof, like something pulled from the pages of an old book. Inside, there was only an elderly pastor and a few wooden pews. No spotlight, no wedding flowers. Richard took her hand, his voice low and slightly shaking. "If you'll say yes, the rest of my life will finally mean something." Emily didn't answer right away, but her eyes welled up, and the nod she gave, light as it was, carried the weight of a lifetime. St. Elm's had no music, no bridesmaids, and no one taking pictures. They got married on a gray, windy afternoon, the breeze catching the edge of Emily's simple cream dress. The pastor was an old man with a raspy voice, someone who had performed ceremonies for Richard back when he was young. The 2 witnesses were a couple from a nearby house, called over in the middle of grilling burgers in their backyard. Richard wore a white shirt, no tie, no jacket. She'd only had time to buy a small bouquet of lilies from a roadside stand, just enough to hold in her hands. None of his family knew, and none of hers did either. After the wedding, there was no honeymoon. Richard brought her home to the beach house in Venice Beach, a white painted villa with wide windows that opened straight to the ocean. It used to be his weekend escape. Now it became their home. Every morning, the sound of waves crashing against the balcony played like a song that never ended. Emily usually woke up before him, made coffee in the old French press, opened the curtains, and set down a mug of warm milk next to his favorite toast, honey and peanut butter. Their life was quiet, steady, like a sad but comforting jazz tune. Richard wasn't as busy anymore. He worked remotely, spent more time reading, and tended to the plants in the backyard. In the evenings, they'd walk the shoreline hand in hand, talking about whatever book she was reading or the pasta dish he was trying to master. But one thing never changed. Richard still kept her away from anything involving his family. When Orion Capital hosted its 20th anniversary gala, he went alone. When his daughter Clara received a Young Lawyer of the Year award, he sent Emily a photo and a message. "She'll understand things better someday." Emily didn't ask why she wasn't invited along. She'd let go of that hope early on. Instead, she held on to what she did have: the softness in his eyes every morning, the way his hand always reached for hers when they watched movies on the sofa, his voice reading to her at night. That love, quiet as it was, still felt real. But sometimes, small things were impossible to ignore. One Monday afternoon, while tidying up Richard's office, she accidentally came across an old photo frame face down in a desk drawer. She flipped it over. It was a wedding photo of Richard and his ex-wife, the two of them standing in front of a grand wedding hall, warm yellow lights glowing, her gown flowing, and Richard smiling, young and proud. She put the frame back just as it was, face down. But that night, she couldn't sleep. She didn't envy that woman. She didn't resent the lavish wedding. What kept her awake was the question: how could a man who once loved so openly, once proudly shared his marriage with the world, choose to hide her like a mistake? That night, she took out paper and a pen and wrote a letter by hand. She never meant to send it. It was just a way to keep the weight of her feelings from suffocating her. If a man isn't willing to give you a picture frame, are you sure you're really in his life? She folded the letter and tucked it into the pages of a Murakami novel on the bedroom shelf. Richard would never read that book, and maybe he'd never know what she had written. The next morning, everything went on as usual. Richard kissed her lightly on the forehead as he left the room and asked if she wanted boiled eggs or an omelet for breakfast. Emily smiled and said nothing about the photo. She told herself, if he loves me the only way he knows how, then I'll love him the only way I can endure. But endurance has limits, and a love without pictures, without proof of its existence, was it really any different from a beautiful dream you keep trying to remember but can never quite name? That morning, Emily woke up like she always did, to the soft sound of waves outside the window and the faint smell of freshly ground coffee in the air. She wrapped herself in a light robe and headed to the kitchen, preparing 2 slices of toast for breakfast. But something felt off. Richard still wasn't up. Usually he was the one out of bed first, brewing the coffee and turning on the market news by 6:30. Today the clock read nearly 7:15 and the bed was still untouched. She opened the bedroom door. Richard lay on his side, face turned into the pillow. The morning light from the window spilled across half of his face, so peaceful it felt unnatural. Emily stepped closer and called his name. No response. She touched his shoulder, then shook him harder. The coldness of his skin made her chest tighten. She called 911. Her hands shook as she dialed. Her voice cracked. My husband isn't breathing." The paramedics arrived 8 minutes later. Too late. They checked, took notes, shook their heads gently, and spoke in that tone people only use when delivering bad news they've given too many times. Cause of death: cardiac arrest in his sleep. No pain, no struggle. Richard Bennett, billionaire, legendary investor, a man who had once spoken to crowds of thousands, had slipped out of this world quietly, in a bed witnessed by only one person, the wife he never made public. The news reached Orion Capital, then his family. Less than an hour later, a black SUV pulled up to the gate of the villa. The first to step out was Clara, Richard's eldest daughter. Dark slacks, a blazer, her hair pulled back tight, her expression unreadable, cold, controlled. Clara walked in and looked straight at Emily. No need to ask her name, no need for confirmation. She simply said, "Who are you? Why are you here?" Emily started to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Not from fear, but from the certainty that whatever she said, Clara wouldn't believe her. Clara motioned to the man beside her. a broad-shouldered figure, maybe a bodyguard or assistant, and told him to escort Emily out. "We'll handle this within the family," Clara said, without even looking at her. Emily stood there for a few seconds. In her hand was the cup of coffee he never got to drink. On the table was Richard's phone, the one he used to text her goodnight every evening. She didn't cry. She just set the cup down, picked up the phone, and walked out of the room without saying a word. After that, no one contacted her. 3 days later, obituaries ran across every major media outlet. Richard E. Bennett, founder of Orion Capital, passed away at his private residence in Venice Beach. He was 61. He died surrounded by family. No mention of her name, no line about a wife, not a trace that anyone had shared those final years with him. Emily didn't react. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't go to the office. She didn't post anything online or reach out to the press to set the record straight. She knew if she never had a place in his public life while he was alive, then in his death, she was even more invisible. That afternoon, she walked along the beach, the same stretch where they used to sit on a stone bench, drink cold beers, and laugh about pointless things. The ocean was still the same, but the bench was empty. Emily returned home after dark and sat down at Richard's desk. The drawer still held the old wedding photo with his first wife. Next to it was an unfinished investment plan and a folder of documents she had never been allowed to touch. She didn't open it. Instead, she pulled a sheet of paper from her own drawer, sat down, and began to write. She didn't cry as she wrote. Her hand was steady. Her handwriting, clean, even, and calm, looked more like a quiet instruction to herself than a message for anyone else. She folded the letter into thirds, slipped it into a plain white envelope, sealed it, and left it unaddressed. Then she placed it in her brown leather bag, the one Richard had given her during a short business trip to Chicago, telling her, "You need something that'll last you for years." She closed the door, standing still for a moment as she looked around the house one last time that day. Everything was just as it had been. Richard's bedside lamp still on, the loafers he wore for walks tucked neatly beneath the chair. Except now, the only man who ever loved her, in a way that was never fully, was gone. No note, no sign that he meant to leave her anything, other than an empty house and a truth the world refused to acknowledge. In the 3 days that followed, Emily didn't receive a single call from Richard's family. No one informed her of the funeral. No one asked if she was okay, but she still knew exactly when and where it would happen. Richard had once told her where he wanted to be buried. "Someplace with shade, where it's quiet enough, no one can bother me even after I'm dead," he joked. Greenlawn Memorial Park. She found the funeral details in a brief article on Orion Capital's website. Her name wasn't mentioned, of course, but she knew she had to be there. The late autumn haze draped over Los Angeles like the city itself was in mourning. Sunlight barely broke through the canopy of old oak trees, casting a soft gray-gold tint over the funeral. Greenlawn Memorial Park, Richard Bennett's final resting place, was packed. Cars lined the entrance. Reporters were kept at the gates, but everyone knew the names inside. Financial titans, attorneys, celebrities who had once invested with him, and of course, family. Emily stood at the edge, where the grass was still damp with dew, and no one bothered to look. She wore a black coat, hair loose, dark sunglasses covering most of her face. She stood behind a large tree, just close enough to see the gathering around the gleaming black casket resting on a wooden platform in the middle of the lawn. The eulogy was being read. Clara sat in the front row, her face cold as stone. Zachary beside her, head bowed, his fatigue barely hidden. All eyes were fixed on the man who lay in that box and on the perfect image built around him. Founder, devoted father, respected philanthropist. Emily wasn't part of that picture. As the pastor began his final words before the casket was lowered, Emily took a deep breath. Her hand clenched the brown leather bag, where the letter she had written the day Richard died still sat. She began walking slowly from the back, moving through the rows of chairs. A few people turned to look, some with curiosity, others with dismissal. She kept walking, step by step, until she was just a few feet from the grave. No one stopped her. No one had time to. She gently placed the white envelope on top of the casket, right where a sliver of sunlight had broken through. Not a word, not a glance exchanged. Then she turned and walked away, steady and sure, as if nothing was left to hold her there. One of the funeral staff reached for the envelope, planning to hand it to the family, but Clara waved her hand and whispered something under her breath. Another staff member moved to toss it aside. "Probably just a letter from an old fan," someone murmured. But Zachary, Richard's youngest son, stepped forward. "Let me see it." Zachary held the envelope and carefully tore it open. Inside were 3 items: a copy of a marriage certificate between Richard Bennett and Emily Jameson, filed in Santa Barbara County, a handwritten note in bold blue ink: "If you'll say yes, the rest of my life will finally mean something." And lastly, a small, slightly blurred photo, a wedding picture taken inside St. Elm's Church. Richard in a white shirt, no tie, standing beside Emily, who was looking at him with the faintest smile. At the bottom corner, Richard had written in silver pen, "For you, no witnesses needed, just you knowing is enough." Zachary said nothing. Clara looked at him, about to ask, but stopped cold when her eyes caught the paper in his hands. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Not in the air, something deeper. The weight of the funeral itself had changed. Whispers rippled through the crowd. A few guests glanced around, murmuring, trying to spot the woman who had placed the letter. But Emily was already gone. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She walked as if she'd lived that moment 100 times in her head. She knew they'd look, knew they'd be confused, knew the questions would come, but she didn't need to stay and watch it unfold. She had lived in the shadows too long to care about a spotlight that arrived too late. Outside the cemetery, she flagged down a taxi back to Venice Beach. In the rearview mirror, she caught her own reflection, colder than usual, but lighter too. No one inside that funeral knew she had lived in that house for 4 years, that she had held the hand of the man inside that coffin every night, had listened to him whisper plans that would never happen. They only knew who he was on paper. She knew who he was when no one was watching. She got home, took off her sunglasses, washed her face, and made a cup of peppermint tea. No funeral flowers, no condolence hugs, no one saying "I'm sorry for your loss." But she had something no one at that funeral did: the truth. And the truth? Sometimes it doesn't need to be proven. It just needs to be left where it belongs, like a letter on a coffin before the dirt buries every denial. 2 weeks later, a blog post surfaced from a writer who closely followed the financial world, the same one who had penned an unofficial biography of Richard 3 years earlier. The post was titled, "The Invisible Wife of Richard Bennett." In it, the writer recounted what happened at the funeral: the unknown woman who placed an envelope on the casket, the contents of the letter, and the blurry wedding photo that hinted at a relationship no one had ever heard of. The post didn't outright claim she was Richard's wife, but it asked the kind of questions that couldn't be ignored. How could someone like Richard Bennett, brilliant, guarded, obsessively controlled, let something as huge as a secret marriage surface only after his death? And if it's true, why is the family staying completely silent? Within 3 hours of publication, the article was shared thousands of times on Twitter. News outlets jumped in. Los Angeles Weekly reprinted it in full. Business Herald launched a special podcast episode dissecting the situation. Even entertainment media pounced. Did Richard Bennett have a secret wife? Who was the woman at the funeral? No guests, no photos. Was it real? The media storm wasn't fueled by scandal. It was driven by something deeper. It struck a nerve people rarely talk about. A woman loved in the dark, then erased the moment the lights came on. The Bennett family came under heavy fire. Social media flooded with posts mocking Clara and Zachary, captions reading, "Unconditional love, except for one." The hashtag Invisible Wife began trending across platforms. Journalists bombarded the Bennett family law office, demanding confirmation of Emily Jameson's existence. But Emily said nothing. She left Los Angeles the very next day after the funeral, never returned to Venice Beach, didn't lock up the house, didn't take any belongings, just a few changes of clothes, some old books, and went back to Boise, Idaho, the place she grew up, the place she once swore she'd never return to. A week later, she submitted an application to teach again at Eastview High School, the public school where she'd once worked as a teaching assistant. When the principal asked, "Weren't you in LA? Your name sounds familiar," she simply smiled and said, "Probably just someone else with the same name." Reporters showed up at her parents' old house. They'd been gone for years. They tracked down former friends. None of them knew anything. A few even found the address of her rented third-floor apartment. They knocked. But all they got was one line from the neighbor. She's not seeing anyone, doesn't take mail, doesn't leave a message. Meanwhile, Richard's family hired an entire legal team to review the legitimacy of the marriage. They didn't outright deny the documents, but they worked to undermine them. A source from the law firm Bennett and Goldstein told reporters, "We're examining the legal standing of this marriage, especially given that Mr. Bennett never disclosed it to his family or company." But the facts were stubborn. The marriage certificate was authentic. The blurry wedding photo had metadata that matched the reported date. The handwriting in the letter was consistent with Richard's known notes. Every attempt to erase Emily only made her name louder. Back in her small Boise apartment, Emily slowed her life down. She walked to school each morning, taught literature and visual arts, ate lunch alone in the library, and read by the window at night. No one at Eastview asked too many questions. She dressed simply, spoke softly, and never once mentioned Los Angeles. One October evening, the rain came down hard. Wind rattled the window panes, making the paper on the desk tremble slightly. Emily opened a drawer and took out a small wooden box. Inside was the original letter, Richard's handwritten proposal, the one she had photocopied and placed on his casket. She read it again, every word echoing in her mind in his voice. "You don't have to be anyone else, just be you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserve that." She folded the letter, struck a match. The flame rose, small but certain. She let the letter burn until only fine ash remained, not out of anger, not to forget, but because she understood, what was real never needs to be kept to prove it, and what was never acknowledged, keeping it only prolongs the pain. From that day on, her room held only books, sketchpads, and one woman who had chosen to disappear, in the same way she had once been loved, quietly, without declaration, unseen, but still real. And this time, on her own terms. Every morning before class, Emily kept her routine, brewing a cup of ginger tea and checking the mailbox on the ground floor. Most days, it was just utility bills, flyers, or notes from parents. But that morning, she found a stiff cream envelope embossed with the logo of Goldstein and Bloom, the law firm that had represented Richard in some of his biggest deals. She opened it while sitting in her usual seat in the school library, where the light was soft and the footsteps of students hadn't yet filled the halls. Inside was a neatly arranged packet of documents, with a cover letter titled, "Re-Inheritance of Personal Assets, the Estate of the Late Richard E. Bennett." She sat still for a few seconds, not out of shock, but because, after everything, it was the first time her name and his appeared side by side on something official. Richard had left her the majority of his personal, non-corporate assets, everything outside Orion Capital. That included the Venice Beach villa, his private savings account, partial shares in several solo investment ventures, and the car she once turned down, telling him, "I'm fine walking." Estimated value, around $11 million. She read the documents over and over. Not because she was uncertain, but to make sure she was still okay with saying no. 3 days later, she sent it all back, every page, along with a single handwritten note on A5 paper, just one line. "I don't need the assets. I need to be named." No explanation, no demands, no negotiation. She signed it, folded it carefully, and mailed it by registered post. She didn't keep a copy. The news wasn't widely publicized, but the financial world noticed. Those following the story of the invisible wife knew. Emily Jameson, the woman hidden so completely she wasn't even invited to the funeral, had become the only person to turn down a fortune most would dream of. Richard's family was left off balance. Every strategy to protect their image, every legal angle aimed at erasing her role, now rendered meaningless. Because the woman they once considered to have nothing to lose turned out to be the one who wanted nothing at all. A week later, Emily received a handwritten letter with no return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Clara, the same woman who had once looked her up and down in the Venice Beach villa and asked, "Who are you?" In the letter, Clara wrote, "I didn't think I'd ever write this letter, but maybe your silence taught me more than any conversation could. If there's one thing I can say now, it's this. I'm sorry. Not because my father loved you, but because we never let him say it out loud." Emily read the letter in silence, then folded it and placed it in the bedside drawer. She didn't cry. She didn't write a reply. Instead, she sent back a small envelope. Inside, no words, no letter. Just the wedding photo taken at St. Elm's Church, the same one she had left on Richard's casket. And on the back of it, in soft blue ink, she wrote, "He chose me. He just didn't choose a way for his family to know. No anger, no bitterness, no blame, just a final truth, so quiet it barely needed saying." She sealed it, stamped it, mailed it, then stepped out of the post office into the fading light of a late afternoon. On the walk home, she passed a used bookstore and paused to glance at the messily stacked titles in the window display. A small child tugged at their mother's hand, pointing. "Mom, why does she look like the lady in that movie we watched last night?" Emily smiled. Not because she felt seen in a grand movie-like way, but because, for the first time in months, she realized she was visible. Not to the media, not through someone else's last name, but to a stranger who didn't need to know who she was, only that she was there. And for her, that was enough. Emily didn't check her mailbox again for weeks after sending the wedding photo to Clara. She wasn't waiting for a response. She didn't expect another apology. That was her final gesture toward a family that had tried to erase her. Not with shouting, but with silence. And just like them, she chose to end things in her own way. Quiet, clean, without mess. 3 months later, on an early winter night, as wind swept through the old brick buildings of Boise, Emily opened her laptop, launched a blank document, and started to write. Not a memoir, not an accusation, not a letter to anyone, just a blog post, no title, no byline, no profile picture. She created an anonymous account, left no contact info, disabled comments, and didn't share it on any platform. She simply clicked publish. The blog post told the story of a marriage the world never saw. Each paragraph read like a whisper. From the first date at Java Grove, to the quiet nights in the seaside villa, to the funeral where she placed a letter on a casket no one knew she had a right to stand beside. There were no names, no dates. Just the story of a woman who had once loved a famous man in a way no one ever knew and let go of him without taking a thing. The post ended with a single line. If someone loves you but won't introduce you, are they protecting you or protecting themselves from you? No flourish, no moral. Just that question, quiet but sharp enough to echo in people's lives. 3 days later, it began to spread. Someone screenshot it and posted it to Reddit's "Arsh True Off My Chest." Title: I broke up with my boyfriend of 3 years after reading this. It got tens of thousands of upvotes. Comments poured in from everywhere. Women telling their own stories of being the secret, of being called just a close friend, of being left out of every family photo like they were never really there. On TikTok, someone read that final question aloud, voice trembling. If someone loves you but won't introduce you. The video racked up over 4 million views in just 48 hours. Therapy forums, relationship podcasts, even licensed counselors began quoting it. No one knew who wrote the post. No email, no contact info. Just a few sharp-eyed readers who noticed the writing style, the voice beneath the words, and whispered theories. It's her, the woman from Richard Bennett's funeral. A New York publisher reached out through the blog's encrypted contact system. They offered to turn the post into a memoir. 6-figure advance, no deadline pressure, full creative control. No response ever came. Emily never wrote another word. She shut down the blog exactly 1 week after it crossed 1 million views. And in her small Boise apartment, she returned to the same quiet life, teaching, sketching, reading, sometimes walking around the lake on late weekend afternoons. No one there knew she had ever been someone's wife. And for her, that was perfect. In late December, she took a week off and boarded a train to Oregon. No heavy luggage, just a small backpack, a few warm clothes, and an old sketchbook Richard had once bought from a roadside shop. That morning, she stood facing the ocean at Cannon Beach, the place she'd seen in films she loved as a girl. Waves lapped gently at the shore, the wind carried a trace of salt, and the sun rose slow and soft, pale gold against the cold sky. She didn't bring a camera, didn't check her phone. She just stood there, staring into the endless open. In her hand was the worn sketchbook, spine frayed with time. She opened to a blank page, drew a few soft lines, scribbled a handful of scattered words. No sadness left sharp enough to turn into tears. No anger loud enough to hold on to. Only stillness. No one came. No one needed to. And in the end, she truly belonged to her own life. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need permission. She didn't need anyone to say her name, because now she knew it herself. You might not remember her name, because no one ever introduced her. Not in a headline. Not in a framed photo on the wall of the man she once called husband. Not in the obituary. Not on the funeral program. No one ever clearly said this was his wife. But you remember her question. And that alone made millions of people stop. If someone loves you but won't introduce you, are they protecting you or protecting themselves from you? Emily never sought justice through courts. She didn't turn pain into payout. She didn't fight, didn't plead, didn't explain. The only thing she ever asked for was to be called by her real name. And strangely, it was that silence that echoed louder than any scream. Emily's story makes us wonder, how many people have quietly stood on the sidelines just because they loved? How many have sacrificed in silence just to exist in a love no one dared to name? She wasn't weak. Her endurance wasn't submission. It came from a quiet kind of strength. The strength to bear loneliness, to survive being forgotten, to carry the truth of a love only she knew was real, even when the world refused to see it. But what about you? Could you accept a love that stays in the dark for years, without photos, without introductions, without being called partner or wife when it matters? Have you ever been in Emily's place? Or worse, have you ever made someone else live as Emily because of you? Leave a comment. Share this if you've ever loved someone you weren't allowed to mention. Or if you've ever loved someone quietly and one day realized you weren't a part of their life, just a part they kept hidden. And if you're in that kind of relationship right now, maybe Emily's question will help you see it clearly. Are they protecting you or protecting themselves from your existence? Thank you for staying with us till the end. If this story reached you, hit subscribe. Each week, we'll bring you a love story that's true, but not always pretty. Because love doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be real.